Welcome to Washington Hospital Today, the program dedicated to sharing timely information about the community hospital that's been taking care of Washington Township Healthcare District residents since it opened in 1958. Washington Hospital Today is provided for the sole purpose of informing residents about healthcare topics and issues that have been covered during community forums, free health and wellness classes, or as part of educational sessions held during the district's open board meetings. This program is one more way that Washington Hospital helps empower you, the residents of the district, by providing information needed to make informed decisions about your health.
Today's presenters are Dr. Rohit Sehgal and Lorie Roffelsen. Dr. Sehgal is board certified in cardiovascular disease, interventional cardiology, and internal medicine. He specializes in cardiology and interventional cardiology. Dr. Sehgal completed medical school at All India Institute of Medical Sciences. He completed his residency at John H. Stroger Jr. Hospital of Cook County in Chicago and Wayne State University School of Medicine in Detroit. He completed his fellowship at McGraw Medical Center of Northwestern University, Chicago, and St. Vincent Hospital Medical Center. Lorie Roffelsen is a registered dietitian at the Washington Hospital Healthcare System. Lorie completed her studies at San Francisco State University. She is a prominent speaker for Washington Hospital's community outreach educational programs.
This talk is on good fat and bad fat. And I have to tell you that this was a journey for me as well. I mean, I've been a cardiologist for many years. I mean, I've practiced in Fremont now over 20 years. And it's easy in cardiology to just go with the standard dictum that's been sort of gospel since the 60s and 70s that, you know, fats are bad for you and that all fats are bad for you. And there's kind of, you know, we shun things that are high in fat. And it's kind of interesting how not all of that was really backed up by scientific data and sort of research. Some of it was true, and some of it was an extension of the truth. And gradually, as time has gone on, there's been some more scientific analysis of some of these things, and what was thought of as being gospel, it has now been tempered down somewhat, and that for me was a real, you know, learning process and a learning experience as well. So first of all, what is fat? So fat's an important part of the diet. You can't live without fat. It supplies energy. It's the most concentrated form of energy in the different foods that we have, and it also carries what we call the fat-soluble vitamins. It provides a reserve store of energy, promotes healthy skin, promotes normal cell growth, acts like a cushion and a heat regulator to protect your vital organs, and very important, it helps you feel full longer. So the satiety associated with eating meal with fat is much more so than with foods like carbohydrates and so on, and that becomes important as we go along this journey of trying to understand this thing. And I have to preface it with saying that there is a lot of confusion actually, and the final word is not out yet in terms of the role of fat in the diet. It's an area of active research, so there are some things which will look like unanswered questions or things that are still not fully worked out, and that's just where the science stands today. Fat adds flavor to food. So it's the most concentrated source of food energy. There are 9 calories in every gram of fat. That's roughly twice the calories from proteins and carbohydrates. Now, when we talk about fat, a normal thing that we will also need to go to is what is cholesterol. That's a common buzzword of today, and people often link fat and cholesterol. And cholesterol is a waxy fat-like substance that's found in all the cells of the body. It's an essential part of the body, actually. It's a chemical that's necessary to make some of the neurotransmitters and hormones in the body. it is manufactured in the body. So the bulk of the cholesterol in your bloodstream is actually manufactured in the body itself. The way that the cholesterol travels in the blood is it's in the form of little boats or packages mixed with proteins. And although it's the same chemical molecule, there's some of the cholesterol found linked to what are called low-density lipoproteins, which are like little boats traveling through the bloodstream, which have a high amount of cholesterol and a small amount of protein molecule. And then there are other boats which contain a lot of protein and a small amount of cholesterol, and those are called high-density lipoproteins. So the low-density lipoproteins are what is typically called the bad cholesterol, and then the high-density lipoproteins are what are typically called the good cholesterol. When we talk about cholesterol, we'll also often talk about triglycerides, which are another kind of fat in the blood. So in terms of cholesterol, it never floats free in your blood. It's always mixed with proteins and travels in the form of bound to a protein. While the triglycerides, which is another kind of fat in your blood, is floating free in the blood. It fluctuates a lot more than the levels of cholesterol, and it's a source of energy and also the main way the body stores fat. High triglycerides can increase your risk for heart disease as well. Going back to the 70s, in a study called Mr. Fit, where they looked at 60,000 people and their incidence of heart disease, which is mainly coronary artery disease or clogging in the arteries of the heart, and they correlated it with levels of cholesterol, they did find a significant increase in coronary artery disease or clogging in the arteries of the heart in people who had high cholesterol levels. And that formed the basis for all, our current thinking that we really need to keep our cholesterol levels under control, and cholesterol is not good for you, and so on. It's typically the bad cholesterol or the LDL cholesterol which is the bad player in terms of your cholesterol levels. And again, that's the cholesterol that travels in these lipoproteins or boats or packages where they have a small amount of protein and a large amount of the cholesterol, and that cholesterol can often migrate from those boats and form plaques in the blood vessels, and that's why the LDL cholesterol is considered bad for you. The interesting thing is that your blood levels of cholesterol are really not impacted very much by the amount of cholesterol that you eat. So it's primarily affected by the fats and carbohydrates in your diet, but not necessarily by the actual cholesterol that you eat. It's also impacted on by your genes. Even though there is still a recommendation that we keep the amount of cholesterol in our diet limited to 300 milligrams a day, which is roughly the amount of cholesterol in one egg yolk, that is not as strict a recommendation other than people who have really, really high levels of cholesterol, where they're sensitive to the levels of cholesterol in the food as well. So for most people, your blood level of cholesterol will be impacted on by the amount of carbohydrates that you eat, by the amount of other fats that you eat, and not by the amount of cholesterol itself. The low-density lipoproteins is the bad cholesterol package, so to speak. After cholesterol is manufactured in the liver, it takes it to other parts of the body for cell membrane formation and for hormone formation and so on. If too much LDL cholesterol is circulating, the excess amounts of cholesterol can build up in the blood vessel walls. This buildup can increase the risk of heart attacks, strokes, and so on. And that's why the LDL cholesterol has been known as bad cholesterol. So LDL, an easy way to remember is the L for the low density can also translate into lousy. So the bad cholesterol is the LDL cholesterol. The HDL cholesterol picks up excess cholesterol and takes it to the liver. These are the cholesterol boats or packages which have most amount of protein and a small amount of the cholesterol in the individual package or boat. And they work as kind of garbage trucks or scavenger trucks floating through the circulation and taking up some of the cholesterol from the blood vessel walls and trying to take it to the liver to have the cholesterol broken down and so to speak, put away and rendered harmless. This is one of the seminal trials, which was a research study done back in the late 70s, early 80s. Dr. Stamler from Northwestern University in Chicago was part of this trial called Mr. Fit, where they showed that as the levels of cholesterol increase, the risk of heart disease increases proportionately. And that led to the whole concept of trying to keep the cholesterol levels low. And then further research narrowed it down primarily to that bad cholesterol or LDL cholesterol that we talked about. So foods that are high in cholesterol are egg yolks, liver organ meats, shellfish, and most meat products always contain cholesterol. But again, this is a really key thing. For most people, the amounts and types of fats and carbohydrates that you eat really have a greater effect on your blood cholesterol than does the cholesterol itself that you eat. And also, of course, the genes that you're born with. Coming down to fats, which is our primary topic of our talk, the fats found in foods such as butter, chicken fat, corn oil are made up of different combinations of what we call fatty acids. So if you think of fat being a large entity, the fat is broken up or composed of what we call fatty acids. And there are primarily 4 types of fatty acids. There's the common fat found in red meat, butter, and so on, which is called saturated fats. And basically the term saturated or unsaturated refers to the bonds in the carbon molecule. So basically fatty acids are composed of carbon and hydrogen atoms grouped together. And how closely or tightly they're bound and how many bonds there are in the carbon molecules in these acids make them different as saturated fatty acids or polyunsaturated fatty acids or monounsaturated. And the 4th kind, which is really the bad type actually, which is almost a man-made type of fat, is called the trans fats. The common types of fats that we have in animal fats are saturated fatty acids. The polyunsaturated are the fats that you find in corn oil and sunflower oil and even in fish oil for that matter. And the monounsaturated are the fatty acids found in olive oil. Trans fats is primarily a man-made, chemically created kind of fat. So all fats contain fatty acids. The polyunsaturated fatty acids are mainly liquid. So some years ago it was found that these polyunsaturated fatty acids would easily get rancid, they would not store well, they were hard to transport. So the food industry added a process of what we call hydrogenation, or increasing the density of these fats, and created this type of fat called trans fats. And these trans fats are commonly found in commercially baked goods like donuts and sweet rolls, and they're found in pastries that you'll go and buy from the store and so on. Also found in fast foods, and these are really the bad players in the fat world, so to speak. So the saturated fatty acids are typically solid, like butter and lard, and the fats that are liquid at room temperature, like olive oil, sunflower oil, are mainly the unsaturated fatty acids. The monounsaturated fatty acids, and these are typically olive oil, peanut oil are the most common kinds, they appear to lower the bad cholesterol and help raise levels of good cholesterol. So the LDL, or what we call the lousy cholesterol, is lowered and the HDL is raised. So again, since one of the premises of our talk was good and bad fat, these are really part of the good fat, so to speak. Saturated fatty acids, or the saturated fats, these are the common things that you think of, especially in the old days when we would think of fat. This is the red meat and the lard and the butter. They do raise the levels of total cholesterol in the blood. What makes the story a little more complex is that they raise both the bad cholesterol and the good cholesterol. So when you put people on a diet and you remove the saturated fats or animal fats and replace them with carbohydrates, both the bad cholesterol and the good cholesterol levels drop. So their link to heart disease has now been called into some question And previously the American Heart Association diet would say that you should cut down these animal fats to as little as possible, maybe even less than 5 or 6% of the total calories in your diet. Now, in the newest guidelines, which still go back to 2010, they've loosened that up a little bit and are saying now that you can go up to 10%, mainly because the association of heart disease and these animal fats is not that clear-cut any longer, and there's been some question that they don't cause as much harm as they were thought to. We still haven't reached the level where we are advocating that, okay, go out and eat red meat as much as you can and so on, but this is work in progress, but there has been some retooling of the previous thoughts that you shouldn't eat any butter at all, you shouldn't eat any red meat at all, because there is some question about their association with heart disease. So way back in the 50s and 60s, there was a trial called the 7-country study, which was a physiologist and scientist called Ansel Keys. And Ansel Keys is famous because he also developed the K ration for folks in the military, and it was named after him, and that's why it's called the K ration. So he did this study where they looked at different countries, and according to his data, they found that there were countries that had high intakes of saturated fats had high incidence of coronary artery disease. And for a while, for the last 30, 40 years, that was held to be sort of dogma. But when people went back and looked at his data, they found that there were many loopholes and flaws, and they found that there were some countries where he'd found low incidence of heart disease where they actually had high saturated fats, and vice versa. So the data became a lot more murky, and that's why this current research on this is still ongoing. Even so, we still advocate a limited amount of these saturated fats, but just try and keep in mind that they are not like poison as we used to think they were. So polyunsaturated fatty acids are, again, a player of the good fats, so to speak. They appear to lower total cholesterol levels and triglyceride levels. Many vegetable oils are part of this category. And the omega-3 fatty acids, or the fish oils, are also a type of polyunsaturated fatty acid. And these have been shown to raise good cholesterol levels, decrease triglyceride levels, and lower the bad cholesterol levels. We talked about the hydrogenation process, where the unsaturated fats are hydrogenated or made into trans fats to make them easier to transport and firmer in texture. And these are clearly bad players. This is clearly the bad fat, because they raise the bad cholesterol, lower HDL, and they clearly increase the risk of heart disease. So I would say avoid the stick margarine. The soft margarine, which is primarily vegetable oils, is fine, but the stick margarine is bad. Avoid the commercial baked goods. The FDA now requires food manufacturers to state, or fast food restaurants also to state, if there are trans fats or trans fatty acids in the products. So watch out for them. One way they have of getting around that is that they don't say trans fatty acids, but they'll say partially hydrogenated oils, which is really the same thing as trans fats. So if you see that on the label, avoid that as well. The other very interesting thing which I sort of came across as I read for this talk was that the incidence of diabetes and obesity paralleled the rise in low-fat diets. So, as we went back to the 50s and 60s, when there was this big epidemic of coronary artery disease, middle-aged men were dying of heart disease, and it was the biggest sort of scourge of society. There were all these research trials, and we talked about the 7-country study and so on. And until then, fats had been part of the diet, but then all of a sudden, fats were thought to be really bad, and they were completely dropped from the diet. So the food and the diet is, in a sense, a zero-sum game. So if you take away something, you have to add calories and energy from some other source. So unfortunately, this is one of the big downsides of what's gone on in public health and in this field. Unfortunately, when we moved away from fatty foods, the food industry sort of geared up. This was this big commercial opportunity, and the whole industry of fat-free substitutes or low-fat foods were formed. The low-fat foods were mainly carbohydrate-rich foods, and those actually led to an increase in obesity, diabetes. This is a really interesting study which I really found interesting, that right from the 70s and so on, when the low-fat guidelines came up, the incidence of obesity and diabetes has actually spiked upwards. And the reason for that is here on this slide. The low-fat or fat-free processed foods are not necessarily healthy. So there was this big concern that fats are bad, so they moved to the cholesterol-rich foods, which are the fat-free foods, because you still need energy, you still need something to give you the calories to function and for satiety. When all these refined carbohydrate foods were eaten, it caused the sugar levels to spike, the insulin levels to spike, and the high levels of insulin causes the body to go into a storage mode of fat and actually store and build up more fat stores. And as this vicious cycle keeps on going on, eventually there's what we call insulin resistance, which is a resistance to insulin and leading on to diabetes. So in some ways, some of this work in the 60s and 70s did a disservice by triggering off this epidemic of diabetes and people becoming obese. So when you cut back, so even now we say cut back on saturated fats, but instead of replacing them with the carbohydrate-rich foods, instead go to fish and beans and nuts and olive oil and still stay away from excess of carbohydrates. So here I just wanted to summarize the different types of fats and the good fats and the bad fats. So the trans fats, which are really the bad fat player, are in the stick margarine, the margarine which has been sort of hardened out of vegetable oils by adding more of the hydrogen atoms that causes the trans fats to be formed. So avoid those. Avoid the fast food and the margarines and the commercially baked goods. These trans fats increase the LDL, lower the HDL. So basically increase the bad cholesterol, lower the good cholesterol, and they clearly increase the risk of coronary artery disease. Saturated fats we've talked about, they do increase total cholesterol, and what used to say is that they definitely increase risk of coronary artery disease. Now that's a maybe, and some newer research, even newer than this slide, in the last year or two, seems to suggest that they may be somewhat neutral in terms of coronary artery disease, but still keep it in moderation till the final answer is out, because this is still work under progress, and it's going to take many, many years to shift that dogma of the last 40, 50 years, which has been so strong and so enshrined, so to speak. So the monounsaturated fatty acids are thought to be good. They are somewhat neutral, but are good sources of energy, and they are olive oil, cornflower oil. And by the way, each source of fat contains a mix of all of these, so there are some that are more in one or the other. And then the polyunsaturated fatty acids, there are what are called the N6 and the N3. The N3 are clearly the better kind, and that's like the fish oil, the flaxseed oil, walnut oil, and wheat germ, and vegetables of the cabbage family. So in a typical 2,000 calorie diet, it's currently recommended that about 30% of your calories should come from fat sources, which is about 66 grams. No more than 10% of your total calories in a day should come from saturated fats. 20% of the total calories should be from the monounsaturated and polyunsaturated, the vegetable oil type things, the fish oils and the olive oils and so on. Consume 300 or less than 300 milligrams a day of cholesterol, and avoid trans fats. Basically, as a summary, use liquid plant oils for cooking and baking, ditch the trans fats, switch from butter, which is a saturated fat, to the soft tub margarine. Don't use the stick or the hardened margarine, but you use the soft tub margarine, which does not contain the partially hydrogenated oils. at least eat one good source of omega-3 fats, such as salmon and tuna, in the case of vegetarians, flaxseed oil, and cut back to some extent on red meat, cheese, milk, and ice cream. Although small quantities of these are okay. I thought I would just spend a few minutes because we talked about high cholesterol, which is a risk factor for heart disease. Diet does help. So switching your diet to polyunsaturated fatty acids, fish oils, nuts, whole grain products, the so-called Mediterranean diet does help trying to reduce your blood cholesterol levels. But in people whose cholesterol levels are high, often drug therapy is necessary, and the statins are the most widely used and effective drugs to treat high cholesterol. They block your liver from making cholesterol, and they can bring your levels of cholesterol down substantially. Now, like all meds and drugs, they have their pros and cons, and there are some side effects and so on. So they have to be, carefully monitored and taken. But they have been shown now in many studies to cut down the incidence of heart disease in people with high cholesterol levels, and in people who are diabetic or have already had heart attacks, they've been shown to decrease the incidence of second heart attacks or act to prolong their lives. So every few years, there are guidelines that come out which help physicians and patients try to decide which people are appropriate candidates for statin therapy. And the current guidelines came out in 2013, so I just spent a few minutes on that people who have actual coronary artery disease or heart disease should be on statins. People whose bad cholesterol is greater than 190, which is really a high number, should be on statins. And individuals who are diabetic, their LDL cholesterol levels between 70 and 189 should be on statins. And then the fourth group, which is the most broad group and is based on a risk calculator put out by the American Heart Association, that people who are not diabetic but have other risk factors like smoking, high blood pressure, obesity, there's a risk calculator which includes things like family history and so on, that's easily accessible on the internet for both patients and physicians. And in that risk calculation, if your 10-year risk of having a heart event or a coronary event is greater than 7.5%, then it's again recommended that people be on statins. If you're internet savvy, which I'm not very, but I had to have my kids help me with this, and you do a search for ACC-AHA, ACC stands for American College of Cardiology, and AHA stands for American Heart Association. If you look for their risk algorithm or calculator, it'll pop up a site where you can actually calculate your 10-year risk of a cardiac event or a coronary event. And that's what it looks like to some extent. The big difference in the recent guidelines is they recognize the fact that the cholesterol numbers are not as important. There seems to be some additional benefit of the statins beyond their lowering of the LDL cholesterol number as such. There is some benefit that they tend to reduce inflammation in the blood vessels, and so the new guidelines don't put the targets as much as bringing your cholesterol down to a certain number. They just advocate high intensity and low intensity statins for different subgroups and approximate percentages that your cholesterols will come down by.
Well, welcome. I really enjoyed Dr. Sehgal's talk because he gave you a good kind of history and background on the recommendations that we were kind of advocating and following for years on a low-fat diet. And it has kind of come around with more research and understanding and studies of different types of fats and oils, and also looking more at other nutrients in the diet like sugars and how they also impact our risk for heart disease. So the message is not anymore a strict low-fat diet, but really more the focus is on choosing healthy types of oils and fats to include in the diet most of the time. So Dr. Sehgal did talk a little bit about function of fats in the diet, and there's three major macronutrients that the body uses: carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. And so fats do have a lot of different functions. Our body can use fat from the diet for energy and stored fat. So that's kind of how we lose weight, if we're able to kind of draw from those fat stores that we have on our body. And then the body also can use carbohydrates and protein. Our brain mostly likes to use the energy from carbohydrates. Fats help us absorb some nutrients, like the fat-soluble vitamins. And they're used in the body to make hormones, and they're also a component of cell membranes. So fat is an important part of the diet. In the United States, a fat deficit, or that's not really seen unless someone is on an extremely strict diet. Also, the fat that we have on our body kind of helps us to insulate and keep our body temperature regular, kind of like the blubber that you see on whales. And it does give us a way to store excess calories that we eat. And the body has an endless capacity to store calories. And then it can also be something to help us cushion and protect vital organs. All fats have the basic same structure. There's a glycerol backbone attached to long chains of fatty acids. And the length of the fatty acids differ according to what that oil is, and the combination on each of those oils is different. If there's a hydrogen bond on every part of that chain of fatty acids, it's considered more of a saturated fat, and typically those are fats that are solid at room temperature. When there's a double bond or more than one bond in that structure, then you're looking at what we call unsaturated fats, and they have a different structure. And the different structures of all these different fatty acids and oils react differently in the body, and that's why not all fats are used or react in the body the same way. So when it comes to dietary fats, the main message is try to think quality. So I'm going to talk to you today about what are probably better quality or healthier types of oils to consider. So the message is try to eat mostly foods containing fats that are good for the heart. And there's not really any fat or oil I'm going to say today not to eat except trans fats. We'll talk about trans fats. And then think also quantity. So we used to say low-fat diet was really the recommendation. Now think about when you're using fat, it should be added in the diet for cooking, or it might be a fat that's found naturally in food, for example, like nuts or seeds. There's no need to add supplemental fat, which I've heard here and there is kind of a trend. Just get it mostly from real food. And so a low-fat diet is not the message, but too much intake of fat, just like any other nutrient, can lead to excess calories that we don't use and can lead to weight gain. The main organizations that we've drawn for our information is American Heart Association, the National Institute of Health, and they have a branch called the National Cholesterol Education Program. Their recommendations are still what I'm going to follow here, although and they're probably maybe a little bit slow to kind of come up to speed with some of the more current studies. They're very conservative. They want to make sure the data is there and that the information is really sound before they issue different recommendations out to the general public. So for right now, we do emphasize that saturated fat raises the risk for heart disease, and trans fat we know for sure, which is, again, hydrogenated or partially hydrogenated fats. The reason they raise your risk is we know they raise your LDL cholesterol level. And LDL is that type of carrier protein for cholesterol that can be easily oxidized, and it can do damage to the cell lining in your arteries. And which oils do we know do not promote heart disease? So monounsaturated fats, the polyunsaturated fats, and we're going to go into examples of all those different fats. But all fats have the same calories, so keep that in mind. They're all calorie dense, and they have about 9 calories per gram, so that's about 120 calories for every tablespoon of a liquid oil. Still need to kind of keep an eye on the amount you use in cooking. Now there have been studies looking at not just individual types of oils or fats, but are there eating patterns that might provide protection from heart disease or reduce our risk for heart disease? And in 2013, there was a study published in the New England Journal of Medicine that looked at the Mediterranean style of eating pattern that is followed kind of in the Mediterranean part of Europe, in Crete, Italy, Spain, kind of that area. And they randomized individuals into 3 groups. And they took people who did not have heart disease, but they were at risk for heart disease. One group was given a low-fat diet to follow. Another group was given this Mediterranean eating pattern to follow with supplemental olive oil to consume. And then the third group was given this Mediterranean eating pattern with nuts to consume. And the 2 groups that were following the Mediterranean eating pattern and what they looked at was over 5 years who had the higher rates of cardiovascular events like heart attack or stroke. And the low-fat diet group had the highest rates of those events. So they're not exactly sure what it is about this pattern. It's not probably an individual food, but maybe the synergy of all these foods that are consumed on a regular basis that have a protective effect on the heart. So what this diet emphasizes is a high intake of olive oil, fruit, nuts, seeds should be included there, vegetables and cereals. And then a moderate intake, so smaller amounts of fish and poultry, and then a low intake or less frequency and small portions of things like dairy products, red meat, processed meat, and also sweets. And then they were also allowed to have wine in moderation, which was, I think, up to like 1 drink per day with a meal that they were consuming. So it's something to consider as if you want to try to adopt some of the foods that you see listed, rather than, try to point out one nutrient to increase or decrease, but just think about an eating pattern overall that might be healthy. Now, one of the charts that you have in front of you is a breakdown of kind of a comparison of different dietary fats that you can choose from. And we're going to talk a little bit about each one. The ones that have more orange, kind of towards the bottom of the chart, are higher percentage saturated fat. And where you see blue, they have some amount of omega-6 fats, and the green represents omega-3 fats. And they're somewhat ranked top to bottom. Flaxseed oil is very high in the polyunsaturated fats, canola as well. There's not any one oil that I say you should use that oil, because they also each have different tastes and functions, and some can be used for, have a high smoke point and can be used for frying. Others have more of a flavor you might want to put on a salad. So we're just going to talk a little bit about each one. When we talk about fats, why are some fats considered bad fats versus good fats? We consider saturated fats and trans fats the bad fats, because saturated fats are shown to raise your total cholesterol and particularly your LDL cholesterol levels, which can contribute to buildup in the arteries. And high cholesterol is just, one risk factor for heart disease, but one that we monitor. And then trans fats have kind of a double whammy. They raise your LDL, they lower your HDL, which is the good cholesterol, and they're believed to increase inflammation in the body, which is not good for your heart as well. So that's really why we emphasize trying to avoid trans fats. So food sources of saturated fat, mostly animal foods like meat. Seafood even has some saturated fat, but a very small percentage if you compare it to like chicken and beef and other animal foods. You can even reduce the saturated fat in something you're preparing by removing visible fat, by taking the skin off the chicken. Even when you're comparing different parts of the chicken breast is lower saturated fat than, say, the leg and the thigh. Then whole milk or full-fat dairy products are also high in saturated fat. Then there's some plant foods, tropical oils like palm oil, palm kernel oil, and coconut oil, which are highly saturated. These are used a lot in commercially baked and packaged foods like cookies and crackers and other kinds of baked goods. And I know because these are plant-based food, they don't have cholesterol, so they can promote on the package, they can say cholesterol-free, but they have probably a lot of saturated fat. So they may have removed the butter, so there's no cholesterol, but they've replaced it with another saturated fat. And you can compare at the grocery store if you're looking. This happens to be reduced fat milk and fat-free milk, so you can see the difference in saturated fat and calories. If you are really trying to reduce your saturated fat intake, you can do that easily by switching to a low-fat or fat-free dairy product. And you can do this with anything you're comparing at the grocery store, whether it's, packaged crackers, or if you're looking at soup, or if you're just buying whole foods like vegetables and fruits, there's not a concern or need to do that. Again, to talk a little bit about trans fats, when they were trying in the 70s to get away from using butter and these saturated fats from animals and going to more of, a low-fat diet in some ways, they would take these liquid oils and hydrogenate them to make them a solid fat. So they became more shelf-stable, they didn't go rancid as easily, and they were used in a lot of commercially processed and packaged foods. So manufacturers liked them because they extended the shelf life of their cookies or whatever they were selling. But with more time and studies and information, we know that trans fats raise your LDL cholesterol, which can contribute to plaques in the arteries, and they do decrease your HDL level. At the grocery store, definitely read food labels carefully. If you're eating out, there's a good chance could be trans fat in those donuts or deep fried chicken, or you certainly can ask what type of oil they use, but because those solid oils have more shelf life and stability, that there's a good chance restaurants might be using those. At home, try to use liquid oils that are just naturally occurring, not hydrogenated, not changed. And there's some controversy here with soft tub margarines, but it's still recommended. Use those as a substitute for butter and for hard stick margarine. So the controversy, butter versus margarine. Some people say, butter is natural, it doesn't have chemicals in it, versus margarine, there's all kinds of ingredients in the margarine. If you really feel strongly about the butter, I probably can't change your mind about using butter. But then I would say use a small amount and try to use it sparingly if you're going to use butter. But if you do want to reduce your intake of saturated fat and cholesterol, there are suitable soft tub margarines that you can choose from at the store. So just kind of follow these guidelines. Choose a soft tub margarine that's made from liquid vegetable oils. So you want to look for that on the label. So the first ingredient could be water or liquid vegetable oil. Choose spreads that have 0 grams of trans fat. And I would compare products and find the one that has the least saturated fat. Why are good fats so good? So what we know about monounsaturated fats is they don't raise your LDL cholesterol level and they don't hurt your HDL cholesterol. So monounsaturated fats are kind of neutral. They have a neutral effect on the heart. Polyunsaturated fats also do not raise your LDL cholesterol. And some studies have shown polyunsaturated fats can decrease your blood cholesterol levels. In addition, omega-3 fats have been studied a lot, primarily the marine type, from fish. And in some studies, they've been shown to decrease inflammation, a risk of sudden death from heart arrhythmias. So there's really more evidence to try to include the omega-3 fats. So let me give you some food sources of these types of fats. If you are looking for good sources of liquid oils that are monounsaturated fats, canola and olive oil are kind of at the top of the list. Peanut, avocados are a good type of monounsaturated fat. And the nuts and seeds are also good sources of monounsaturated fat. Most foods are not 100% monounsaturated or 100% poly. They're usually a combination. But if they're primarily monounsaturated, they're in that column there. And then polyunsaturated fats are found in high concentrations in sunflower seeds and oil, in corn, soybean and soybean oil, flaxseed and flaxseed oil. Also walnuts, and then fish is probably where you may have heard more about the polyunsaturated fats. But they're actually a little bit different. The type of omega-3s we get from fish, we abbreviate them to EPA and DHA. Those were the ones studied more for reduction of cardiovascular events and heart arrhythmias. And so those you find more in fatty fish like anchovy and herring and salmon and mackerel, halibut, Pacific oyster. Most fish have some omega-3 fats, but you'll see that there's some that are a lot higher. Then in plants, there's another form of omega-3s that are sources of alpha-linolenic acid, and flaxseed is probably the best source. Also, you can get it from green leafy vegetables, canola oil, soybean oil, English walnuts, and also wheat germ oil. So currently the American Heart Association, there's enough evidence about the benefit of omega-3s that they've issued recommendations. So for the general public, they say try to eat at least 2 fish meals per week to get the benefit of those omega-3 fats in the fish. Eat a variety of fish, since we know some fish come from different waters. Some people have concern about pollution. That's why if you eat a variety of fish, that kind of spreads your risk a little bit. And also you can, get educated at the store. Where's the fish coming from? Is it wild? Is it farmed? Which country? So you can, pick the best fish. And as well as eating fish, try to eat plant sources of omega-3s. And for vegetarians or people who don't like fish, of course, that's where you're going to, try to emphasize is from the plants. For people who have documented heart disease, maybe you've had a heart attack or you have other risk factors, it's recommended consuming a higher amount of the EPA and DHA per day, preferably from oily fish. But you can also check with your doctor if supplements would be okay for you. And then they also use omega-3s to treat high triglyceride levels. There's prescription level of fish oil that you can be prescribed if you have high triglycerides, which maybe are not related at all to diet, but more of a genetic problem. Okay, now I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the different sort of mainstream oils that we see on the market. Canola is produced from the rapeseed plant, and the word rape in rapeseed comes from the Latin word rapum, meaning turnip. And it was originally cultivated in Canada and then came to the United States. So the word canola came from Canadian oil low acid, so it's kind of an acronym for that. We like or suggest you use canola because it is primarily monounsaturated fat, and then it has about 21% polyunsaturated and also some omega-3 fats, and that's a liquid oil. Coconut oil, there's a few processes to make coconut oil, but it's extracted from the kernel or the meat of mature coconuts from the coconut palm plant or tree. On the market, you'll see virgin coconut oil, which is pressed from dried, or there's a wet method to extract the oil from the coconut. And then there's also another kind they refer to as RBD, or refined, bleached, and deodorized, which doesn't really have a flavor, not necessarily used in cooking, but it's used in pharmaceuticals, might be used in cosmetics. There's actually a lot of use for coconut oil. It has become a sort of the trendy oil right now, and there's a lot of claims out there of what it can do. It can cure Alzheimer's, it's good for your skin, it's good for your hair. There's still a lot of probably studies that need to be done on coconut oil before we say that coconut oil should replace some of these other liquid oils we're talking about because it is highly saturated. The controversy with coconut oil is that a high percentage of it is made of lauric acid, which does two things. It does raise your LDL level, but it also raises your HDL level. So some people argue, well, that kind of cancels out, the problem with the LDL level going up. But experts in heart disease and researchers say that's not necessarily true, and anything that raises your LDL cholesterol can increase your risk for heart disease. And something that raises your HDL does not necessarily do the same thing as far as lowering your risk for heart disease. So the experts say don't replace your liquid oils like olive oil or canola with coconut oil, but you certainly can use it in cooking, probably more in a sparingly way than is the predominant oil that you use at home. Flaxseed, they found a lot of benefits to flaxseed. The whole flaxseed, it has antioxidants, it has fiber, and it has cholesterol lowering effect. Now if they extract the oil, it contains the alpha-linolenic acid component of the flaxseed, which is beneficial, but it won't have the fiber or the lignin component, so it won't have that cholesterol lowering effect if you use the oil. Olive oil is a very popular liquid oil. It's a tree crop. Olives are actually a fruit. And on the market you will see extra virgin olive oil, which comes from the first press of the olives, so that's why they call it virgin. It has low acidity and the best taste, or more superior taste than the other olive oils. You'll also see virgin olive oil, which comes from virgin oil production only. Then you'll see on the market pure olive oil. So there's different grades of olive oil. The taste is going to be different. Sometimes it's a little stronger if it's not the virgin. And then there's olive oil blends, which might be a blend of virgin and refined production oil. There's a lot of options out there, depending on how you're going to use it. Probably for something like a salad where it's not being cooked, you'd want to use a good quality olive oil, like an extra virgin. Why we like olive oil is it's high in monounsaturated fat. It also has polyunsaturated, and it has just a little bit of the omega-3 fats. But again, the monounsaturated fats have like a neutral effect on the heart. Then there's peanut oil, which is high in monounsaturated fat. This has a high smoke point. It's a good one to use for frying or deep frying, and it imparts a good flavor to foods. Its composition is about 50% monounsaturated, about a third polyunsaturated, and 17% saturated. Soybean oil is also popular on the market. That's made from pressed soybeans. It also has a high smoke point, so it could be an oil you use in cooking or frying. It's also used, you'll see it on a lot of packaged foods by the food industry. They like to use it in salad dressings. You'll see it in sandwich spreads. You'll see it in some margarines, and also in mayonnaise and other things like that. You'll also see it in non-dairy creamer. So some of those you just want to look at and see have they hydrogenated or done anything to the oils that are in it. Sunflower oil we like because it's high in omega-6 fats and vitamin E. It also has a high smoke point. It's very light, doesn't have a strong flavor like olive oil does. And it's predominantly monounsaturated fat and polyunsaturated fat, and just a small percentage saturated fat. And safflower oil is similar to sunflower oil. It's oil that's expressed from the seeds of the safflower plant. It also has a very light taste or no taste. So if you're looking, it could be used even in baking because it's not going to change the flavor of what you're baking. And there's two types of safflower oil on the market, so you want to kind of look when you're trying to pick. The monounsaturated safflower oil, that's high in oleic acid, and it should say that on the label. That's used as a heat-stable cooking oil. But if you see the polyunsaturated version of it, which is high in the linoleic acid, that one is used as a cold oil, like in a salad dressing, so you wouldn't cook it. So I want to leave you with some tips to take home regarding fats. With, the holidays coming and baking coming, we might all be running to the store to get our butter to make our cookies and cakes and things. But wherever you can, if there's a recipe where you can replace a saturated fat with maybe a liquid oil, try to do that just as a good change instead of using the butter. I know I have recipes myself that I don't think I can replace with a liquid oil. So in some cases, they have a use and a place. But the message is now a low-fat diet is not necessary, but choose foods with healthy fats. Try to limit foods that are high in saturated fat and avoid as much as possible foods that have trans fat. Try to eat fish 2 to 3 times per week. Try to look for products that use liquid vegetable oil instead of saturated fats or hydrogenated oils. And remember, all fats, even the heart-healthy ones, have a lot of calories. And if we eat more than we can burn, it's likely it will lead to some weight gain. So we still have to keep that in mind. But Dr. Sehgal was saying the trend in obesity and diabetes did kind of coincide with the low-fat diets. So maybe with eating foods that have some fat in them, it will give you some satiety, and possibly you eat less or you're satisfied with that smaller amount that you have.